Care to hear an incredible story about a man who doesn't sleep? Meet the hero of our tale, Thai Nguc Thai Niop, an 80-year-old farmer from Vietnam. If what he says is true, he hasn't snoozed a bit in over 60 years. It all started when he had a terrible bout of fever as a young man, and since then, he claims he hasn't had a single night of rest. Most of us can't even imagine going through a whole day without a few hours of shut-eye. But this man insists that his lack of sleep hasn't affected his life in any negative way. In fact, he leads a happy and active lifestyle, much like anyone else his age. His family, friends, and even his neighbors vouch for him, stating that they have never witnessed him dozing off. The man firmly believes that his complete sleeplessness hasn't had any detrimental impact on his health. This unusual farmer was born in 1942, and at the age of 20, was struck by a severe fever. Although he managed to overcome the episode, he never regained his ability to sleep. Despite trying different medications and traditional remedies, sleep continued to elude him. He held on to the hope that his insomnia would eventually pass. But little did he know that he would go on without sleep for a remarkable 6 decades. His story became something of a legend in his home country of Vietnam, often regarded as a miraculous feat or an extraordinary superpower. However, some doctors offer an alternative perspective. One specialist suggested that the farmer may actually be experiencing short bouts of sleep without realizing it. At times, such individuals struggle to differentiate between being awake and being asleep. So it's possible that this man might be catching some snoozy time during quick power naps throughout the day. Perhaps these brief moments of rest are sufficient to keep him going. It's important to note that he has never consented to undergo thorough testing or observation by sleep scientists, which means his claims and the accounts of those close to him are the only evidence available. Nonetheless, he isn't the only person who claims they haven't slept for several decades. One Asian woman, for instance, claimed to have been sleepless for a staggering 40 years, too. She has become something of a local celebrity due to her unusual ability to stay awake night after night. Just like the Vietnamese farmer, she claims to have been able to sleep properly at one point, but hasn't done so since childhood. At first, her neighbors were skeptical, assuming she was simply exaggerating or seeking attention. To test her claims, they attempted to stay up with her, engaging in late-night games and other activities. Some of them dozed off at the table, while others eventually gave up and returned to their homes. Even her own husband attests to the fact that he has never witnessed his wife sleeping. Instead of catching some well-deserved rest, she busies herself with household chores during the night hours. Concerned for her well-being, her husband went as far as getting her medicine, convinced that the woman had a severe condition. Unfortunately, the remedy proved to be ineffective, leaving the couple perplexed and seeking medical help. When she finally sought assistance from local doctors, they provided little to no relief, since they were unable to offer a medical explanation for this extraordinary condition. In a fortunate turn of events, the woman's search for answers led her to a specialist sleep center. It was there that the puzzle of her sleepless nights began to unravel. As she engaged in a conversation with her husband under the watchful eyes of doctors, they made a remarkable observation. Her eyes began to slow down, and she actually fell asleep while maintaining her dialogue with her husband. Further examination using a brainwave monitor revealed an astonishing fact. The woman's eyes remained closed for no longer than 10 minutes each day. This peculiar phenomenon bears resemblance to how sleepwalkers operate, where the body remains active while the brain slumbers. Essentially, her body continues to function even while she technically sleeps for those fleeting 10 minutes. This intriguing discovery sheds light on why such people genuinely feel as if they haven't experienced a good night's sleep in ages. Most of us don't have these unique abilities, though, and find it hard to get through the day if we haven't gotten a good night's sleep. Why? Because sleep allows our body to recharge, heal, and perform important functions. Ideally, adults should aim for around 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. Let's take a closer look at what happens to our bodies during longer periods of time without sleep. It's not uncommon to go without sleep for 24 hours, and while it won't cause major problems, you can expect to feel tired and a bit off. After a whole day of being awake, you may feel drowsy, irritable, and have difficulty concentrating. You may start to crave some food too, and your eyes will definitely show that you're tired. Once you've been awake for 36 hours, the signs become more intense. You'll have an overwhelming urge to sleep, and you may even have short periods of sleep, known as microsleeps, without realizing it. These microsleeps usually last up to 30 seconds. During this stage, different parts of your brain will struggle to communicate with each other. You may find it difficult to remember certain things and to learn new information. After 48 hours, it might become even harder to stay awake, and you're more likely to experience episodes of microsleep. So, how long does it take to recover from such instances? Well, the good news is that you can bounce back by prioritizing sleep and allowing your body to rest. To start the process, it's recommended to establish a consistent sleep schedule. Try going to bed earlier rather than sleeping in late, and aim for a minimum of 7 hours of sleep each night. This will help your body get back into a suitable sleep routine. Take into account that it might take time to get back to normal, ranging from days to weeks, depending on the duration of your sleepless episode. As a general rule, for every hour of sleep loss, it may take approximately 4 days to fully recover. There are some additional steps you can take to bounce back as soon as possible. For instance, if you've only missed a few hours of sleep, taking a nap can certainly help. However, it's important to keep your nap short, around 30 minutes or less. Make a nice routine for yourself whenever you're planning to snooze. This might mean creating a comfortable sleep environment, avoiding stimulating activities before bed, and limiting exposure to light. Scientists are always discovering cool things about how our brains work. But do you ever wonder what happens to our incredible brain when we sleep? First of all, we know that every living creature, from tiny fruit flies to jellyfish, sleeps. This activity is also special because it has some costs. When animals sleep, they can be vulnerable to other, more powerful creatures. The brain is especially affected by not getting enough sleep. There are 2 types of sleep that our brains go through. One is called rapid eye movement, REM sleep, and the other is non-REM sleep. They each have different brain waves and activities happening in our brains. Non-REM sleep happens when we start falling asleep. Our brain waves slow down, our muscles relax, and our breathing becomes slower. REM sleep is interesting because our brain waves during this time look very similar to when we are awake. This is when we have the most bizarre dreams. The thalamus, an important part of our brain, sends images, sounds, and other sensations that create our dreams during REM sleep. There's a chemical called acetylcholine that is pretty strong during REM sleep. It's also active when we are awake, and it helps our brain remember things. That's why studying before bedtime and sleeping on it can help us remember things better the next day. When we fall asleep, our brain has these special patterns of brain waves called spine spindles. They are still not fully understood, but scientists think they play a role in learning and remembering new things. They might also help us stay asleep, even if there are noises or other distractions around us.
On a rainy evening in a dark, dense forest, you hear the crunch of branches. Your heart starts beating faster. You're afraid to look in the direction of the sound, but you're still slowly turning your head. A feeling of horror freezes you. You can't escape, and you're sure that some animal is looking at you now. By this point, it stopped raining. An ominous silence has fallen over the forest. The clouds disperse, and the dim light from the full moon illuminates the trees, among which you notice a human silhouette. He's tall and is hiding in the shadows. He isn't moving, waiting for your next actions. 2 glowing red eyes light up his dark face. Terrified, you point the flashlight beam at the monster. The scary creature opens its wide wings and flies away into the night. You've just seen the Mothman, one of America's most famous monsters. This is an urban legend, but the monster really exists and doesn't exist at the same time. It all started in West Virginia, in the small town of Point Pleasant in the early 20th century. It was an industrial place with factories producing harmful toxic substances. Closer to the 50s, all these plants were closed, but people didn't dispose of waste from the factories properly. Therefore, harmful substances began to penetrate the surrounding nature and pollute forests and water. These events became a prologue to the appearance of the Mothman. For the first time, city residents heard about the monster in the 60s. 4 young people were driving past the dark forest and stopped by a local power plant. There, they saw a big man with red eyes and wide wings, like those of a moth. The teenagers were terrified and immediately drove away from that place. They came to the local sheriff and told him everything that had happened. The police quickly examined the forest and the area near the station, searching for the monster, but found nothing. Meanwhile, a local newspaper wrote an article about it. Soon, other people also began to report that they had seen a mysterious creature. Some thought the Mothman was a human or an animal that mutated after getting poisoned by toxic substances. These rumors were nothing but fairy tales from sci-fi movies. So, people started ignoring these stories after a while. Then, after the monster's first appearance, a catastrophe happened in the city. The Silver Bridge, the main road to Point Pleasant, couldn't withstand the traffic before the winter holidays. The bridge collapsed under the heavy weight and many cars fell down. The tragedy brought a lot of grief to the town, and people were trying to figure out how could this happen. Some suggested that the crash could be related to the Mothman. No, he didn't destroy the bridge, but people said they had seen this creature many times before the tragedy. It looked like the Mothman was a harbinger of trouble. Further investigation revealed that the road collapsed because of poor bridge maintenance. But this version faded amid the rumors about the Mothman. After the crash, reports about the Mothman stopped. People no longer saw the monster and forgot about it. But then, in the 70s, author John Keel wrote a book about the mysterious monster from Point Pleasant. He liked discussing stories about extraterrestrial civilizations and other urban legends, so he couldn't miss the case of the Mothman. He wrote about how the unknown beast could be an unconscious premonition of Point Pleasant's inhabitants of the tragedy on the bridge. The book became popular all over the US. John Keel made the Mothman a superstar. Hollywood created a movie based on the book, and the small town became the center of attraction for thousands of tourists. The Mothman has become as popular as the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot. People organize an annual festival in honor of this character. If earlier the beast was a harbinger of disaster, now it's become the cause of the economic growth of Point Pleasant. Tourists come to get in touch with the legend and spend a lot of money. Locals open cafes and hotels, organize tours, and make souvenirs. One sculptor even installed a sinister monster statue. The Mothman has evolved from local myth to a brand. In this case, it turns out that even though he doesn't exist, it's not entirely true. Many messages about the Mothman appear all over the world. It's said that people see him shortly before major disasters, but of course, it's yet to be proven. One guy did research and found out that all the books and materials about the Mothman were written by fans of myths and urban legends, and that there was not a single scientific proof or observation that the monster really existed. Now, remember the events associated with the Mothman? The collapse of the bridge? The release of toxic substances and other tragedies? The flying creature with red eyes has become the embodiment of mass hysteria. When many people are under stress or grief, they may experience the same unconscious reaction. In such a depressed state, people really begin to believe and see things that don't exist. A similar feeling appears during a strike or other mass events. You may disagree with the majority opinion, but when you find yourself in a crowd that demands something, you seem to be infected by their mood. This is quite a typical thing for our mentality. When you're experiencing grief along with hundreds and thousands of people around, your brain becomes sensitive to any information. You may see a large heron or an owl in this state and mistake it for the Mothman. And other people will unknowingly support you and believe in the monster. There have been many cases of mass hysteria in the world. One of the most striking ones happened in France in the 16th century when the inhabitants of Strasbourg began to dance for several weeks. This event is called the Dancing Plague. At first, one woman started dancing in the city's central square. A week later, other locals joined her, infected with her bout of sinister fun. According to one version, the mass dancing hysteria began against a backdrop of hunger and diseases that Europe was experiencing at that time. People were under constant stress, and their minds decided to relieve stress in an unusual way. Another version says that people were poisoned by some fungus that grew on wheat grains. The fungus somehow affected people's psyche and made them dance. But let's get back to our monster. In addition to the stress associated with the collapse of the bridge and the release of toxic waste in the forest, people could have been impressed by herons and owls. People called the Mothman bird-like in the first reports because of his red eyes and wings. Therefore, some researchers claimed that the residents of Point Pleasant had seen a big heron or a sandhill crane with wide wings and red markings around the eyes. The sandhill crane doesn't live in West Virginia, but it can fly over this territory and even make a stop there to have a snack. Also, people could have seen a giant owl sitting in a tree. The eyes of these animals can glow red at night. People reported seeing about 28 cranes from 2017 to 2019. Imagine living in a city where shops, streets, and monuments remind you of the Mothman. People have been talking about him for years, believing in him. And then you see a giant heron in the forest. Surely the first thing you'll think about is the Mothman. So people may be telling the truth when they say they've seen him, or at least they might believe they're telling the truth. In any case, the Mothman is neither a product of an extraterrestrial civilization, nor a radioactive mutant animal. People created this creature with their minds and faith. Such things always attract people because they give us the feeling that we know something that most people don't. Something mysterious. Additionally, the Mothman brings a lot of money to the residents of Point Pleasant, and it's much more profitable for them to support the rumors about the monster than to prove that it doesn't exist.
We've heard stories about people surviving in the desert, Amazon forest, and uninhabited islands for weeks. Such stories show how tough and resilient people can be. But among these many cases, there is one that can really amaze you. It's the story about a guy who spent 3 days inside a sunken ship at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't have oxygen tanks, electricity, communications, or food, but he survived. So, it all happened in 2013 on a tugboat that was moving through the Atlantic waters along the coast of Nigeria. That day, early in the morning, there was a small storm. The tug was pulling a vessel with oil tanks. Then, all of a sudden, a huge wave formed. It crashed into the ship and broke the cable. At 4:30 a.m., the tugboat turned upside down. Its entire deck was underwater, and the ship's hull stuck out from the surface. The boat began to sink slowly. The crew of 12 people were trapped, as they all were in their locked rooms. They had closed the doors in their cabins as a precaution, since there were many pirates in those waters. Because of the locked rooms, they couldn't get out. But one of them, cook Harrison Okina, was in the bathroom during this time. The bathroom turned over. Harrison fell on the ceiling. All the clothes and toilet shelves fell on his head. He was stunned and didn't understand what was happening. When he heard the screams of the other crew members, he realized that the ship was sinking. Harrison struggled to his feet. Holding onto the walls, he slowly went out of the cabin. The water level rose above his head. Harrison took a deep breath. He intuitively, driven by fear, reached the engineering room. There was a small pocket with air. This space wasn't wholly flooded, since the water didn't get there, and the air hadn't come out. Harrison realized that this was the safest place for him at that moment. He had no fresh water and no food. He was in a cold, damp room. The floor was flooded, and Harrison's feet began to freeze. There was almost no chance of survival. The man found a soda bottle inside the room and a life jacket with 2 flashlights attached to it. By this time, the ship had descended to the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 100 feet. This is about the height of a 10-story building. The ship's hull was squeezed and made a grinding noise due to the pressure of the water. Then, Harrison heard a strange movement outside the door. It was sharks and other fish that were investigating the deck. At this point, Harrison began to lose hope. Lack of food supplies and pressure weren't the main problems. The air pocket was small, which meant there was little oxygen. Every 24 hours, an average person consumes about 350 cubic feet of air, which means Harrison had less than 1 day left to breathe. But despite this, he lived in such conditions for about 60 hours. This happened thanks to the water. The pressure around the ship was so intense that it compressed the air by about 4 times. Another problem was the cook's breathing. When we inhale, we absorb oxygen. When we exhale, we release carbon dioxide. This substance is dangerous to your health if its concentration in the air is 5%. Harrison slowly filled the room with carbon dioxide, and he couldn't get out. With each hour, it became harder to breathe. But here again, he was lucky. Water absorbs carbon dioxide, and Harrison moved and splashed it in different directions. Thus, unknowingly, he increased the water area and kept the carbon dioxide level below critical. But even here, his dangers were not over. Hypothermia may occur in a dark, cold room. It's a condition when your body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You get cold, and your perception of the world gets distorted. You don't understand where you are and what's going on. You may lose your memory and even experience terminal burrowing. This weird behavior occurs during hypothermia when a person tries to find a small shelter, even if they're in a closed room. They can even start digging the cold floor with their bare hands. At the same time, a person quickly freezes and loses consciousness within 2 hours. Harrison's room was filled from below with icy water. He wouldn't have survived in such conditions if he had stayed on the floor for several hours. But he managed to build a small platform with a mattress. This kept him slightly above the water level. With each passing hour, fear and despair more and more bound the survivor's mind. He couldn't get out for many reasons. One of them was that only a little sunlight passes to such a depth, and Harrison couldn't see it. The soda bottle was almost empty, and the flashlight stopped working. The man found himself in pitch darkness, but his salvation was close. While rescuers were searching for survivors nearby, he was thinking about his family and life. Harrison noticed rays of light through a hole in the wreckage. Divers were examining the seabed. It was the only chance to survive. Harrison came out of the air pocket and swam towards the rescuers. He was making his way through the darkness. The ray of light coming from the diver's flashlight disappeared. Harrison tried blindly to find the diver, but they were at the other end of the deck. His oxygen was running out, so Harrison decided to return. There was almost no air left in his lungs. He began to suffocate, but still got to the rescue room. The main thing was not to despair. It was his only chance for salvation. After catching his breath and replenishing the oxygen supply in his lungs, Harrison made a second attempt. He got out of the room and noticed the diver. He swam towards them with all of his might. The lifeguard didn't see Harrison, so the cook knocked on his neck from behind and grabbed his hand tightly. The diver was initially scared, but he realized a living person was in front of him. Harrison swam to his room and led the lifeguard as his oxygen ran out. You can easily find a recording from the diver's camera on the internet, where the frightened Harrison was in his rescue room during a meeting with the diver. The rescuers gave him an oxygen mask. They didn't believe there was a living person in front of them. Harrison couldn't immediately get to the surface because of the pressure. He spent about 60 hours on the seabed, so he needed to change the pressure level slowly to prevent damage to his health. Therefore, the divers put him in a decompression chamber to gradually reduce the external pressure. Then, when Harrison got out, he saw the stars. The cook thought that he had been at the bottom of the ocean all day, so he was surprised when he found out that he had been underwater for 60 hours. Also, he thought that all the crew members had forgotten about him and left the ship at the beginning. Many years have passed since then, but Harrison still has nightmares about his air room. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and tells his wife that the bed is sinking and they're now at sea. A similar case occurred in 1991 with scuba diver Michael Proudfoot. He was studying a sunken submarine off the coast of Baja California. During this dive, he accidentally broke his breathing regulator and deprived himself of oxygen reserves. Michael couldn't get to the surface because he was too deep. He wouldn't have had enough air in his lungs. Fortunately, the diver found an air pocket inside the ship. He swam there and waited for rescuers. For 2 days, he was underwater in complete darkness. He ate raw sea urchins and drank a small amount of warm water from a found pot. Fortunately, rescuers found him. Michael Proudfoot got out of the trap and stayed alive.
Thick fog is rising over the ocean as the sun is slowly sinking towards the horizon. It's hard to see further away than a few dozen feet, but that's enough to notice a hulking, skeletal shape in the distance. As your ship approaches the figure, your heart beats faster, and then you make out the details of another vessel, abandoned by the looks of it. Ghost ships do exist, and their mysteries aren't always solved. Take MV Hoita, for example. It was a wooden vessel built in 1931 as a luxury yacht. It had served well to various people over 20 years before it was bought by a Samoan sailor and became a merchant ship. In 1955, though, Hoita's service came to an abrupt and mysterious end. On October 3rd, it set sail for another trading voyage that should have taken no more than 48 hours. Delays happen in the sea, so when Hoita didn't arrive on October 5th as scheduled, there was little worry yet. But then it failed to come on the following day too. There was no distress signal or any other sign of Hoita's presence anywhere between its departure and arrival points. A search and rescue party was dispatched to find the ship, and for 6 days, they were scouting the area of nearly 100,000 square miles. On October 12th, the mission returned to the base empty-handed. Hoita vanished without a trace. It was only a month later that another merchant ship, Tuvalu, noticed the missing vessel far away from its route, drifting in the open sea and listing heavily. The sailors boarded the ship and found that all of its crew and passengers, 25 people total, were missing, along with all the cargo the vessel had been carrying. The radio was tuned to the International Distress Channel, meaning that the crew had been trying to ask for help, but they couldn't reach anyone because the radio cable had been damaged, limiting the range to 2 miles. The lifeboats were missing as well, indicating that people on board must have left the ship. Unfortunately, they seem to have taken the logbook with them, leaving the rescue team clueless as to what had happened. Even today, the mystery of MV Hoita hasn't been solved yet. No one knows where the crew and passengers had gone and what had caused them to leave. SV Carol A. Deering wasn't a ghost ship in the usual sense of the word. There were no sightings of it in the open sea. Instead, it was found on the shore. But the circumstances of it running aground are a puzzle shrouded in mystery. Carol A. Deering was built in 1919 in Maine, and it was a large vessel made for commercial voyages. Unfortunately, despite its large cost of construction, it had only served for a year before its last trip. July 19th, 1920. The ship was traveling from Puerto Rico to Rio de Janeiro via Newport News to deliver a cargo of coal. It was almost halfway to the final destination when the captain fell seriously ill, and the crew turned back to drop him and his son off and replace the captain. The voyage went without incident, but when it came to Barbados in December to resupply, there were strange moods among the crew. The first mate didn't seem to be happy with the new captain. No one paid much attention to it back then, when they probably should have. The last sighting of Carol A. Deering at sea was on January 28, 1921, when a lightship noticed it off the coast of North Carolina. There was some commotion on the quarterdeck of the ship, where the crew were normally not allowed. Then, another vessel sighted it, but there was already no one on the decks. On January 31st, the merchant ship was found hard aground in the Diamond Shoals, a site notorious for numerous shipwrecks that had been occupying there for centuries. When the search and rescue party boarded the ship, they found it abandoned, the log and personal belongings of the crew gone, along with the 2 lifeboats. There is still no answer to what happened on board of Carol A. Deering that January, although the most popular version was mutiny. Maybe we'll never find out the truth though. SS Bechimo is perhaps one of the most notable ghost ships in history. This large cargo steamer was built in 1914 in Sweden and plodded its way dutifully over 16 years, trading provisions for pelts with native tribes of Alaska and Canada. But then, on October 1st, 1931, Bechimo got caught in pack ice. At first, it seemed the crew would be able to wait it out and continue on their route because the ship broke free in a couple of days. But in less than a week, it became caught again, this time for good. In another week, a rescue party was sent to fetch 22 of the Bechimo's crew, while another 15 remained behind to wait through the winter if necessary and get the ship back. But a month later, after a powerful blizzard struck their camp, the sailors went out of their shelters only to find the ship gone. Luckily, a few days later, a native hunter told that Bechimo hadn't been lost yet. He'd seen it about 45 miles from where they had been stationed. They managed to track it down, but decided the ship wouldn't survive the winter. So they took the most valuable cargo from its hold and abandoned it. They were wrong though. SS Bechimo did survive that winter, and many more that followed. When the ice broke, it sailed away on its own, drifting listlessly along the shores of Canada and Alaska. There were numerous sightings of the ghost ship, sometimes adrift in the open sea, and at other times stuck in the pack ice again. People attempted to board and salvage it, but weather conditions or lack of equipment always prevented them. SS Bechimo was last sighted by native Alaskans in 1969, 38 years after its abandonment. What became of it later remains unknown. The story of SS Orang Medan is one of the most puzzling and harrowing ghost ship stories of the 20th century. No one even knows for sure if the ship even existed in the first place. It wasn't recorded in Lloyd's Shipping, the International Register of Ships, which makes it either a tall tale or a vessel that avoided being officially recognized for some shady reasons. In any case, the accounts as to what happened to the Medan vary. According to most reports, it was carrying some unknown cargo in the Indonesian waters when a distress call was received by another ship in the vicinity. The officer on duty heard an SOS message, but its contents are different depending on the accounts. The message did not repeat, and the crew of Medan didn't answer to any attempts to contact it back. The ship that received the distress call hurried to the rescue, but they only reached the vessel the following day, when it was already drifting and slightly listing. When the rescuers boarded the ship, they found that none of the crew had survived. However, one lifeboat was missing, which implied that there was at least one crew member who managed to escape. What happened to the rest of the people on board remains a mystery to this day. Still, there are no hard facts about this story, so we might never find out whether SS Orang Medan was actually a ship and not a thing of fiction. SV Zabrina was a 3-mast sailing barge built in 1873 for river trade ships in South America. She served for well over 4 decades, proving to be a sturdy and reliable ship. It was later transferred to Europe, where it continued serving its purpose well. But then, in October 1917, Zabrina set sail on a regular voyage only to be found ashore several days later. Mysteriously, although the ship was perfectly intact, the entire crew of 5 and the captain were gone. There is no direct evidence or hard facts as to what really happened that day. The most convincing theory is that the crew were washed away from the deck because of an underwater explosion. And then the ship sailed ahead without them, but the truth, as always, remains unknown.
It's winter 1980. We're in the small town of Lengby. 19-year-old Jean Hilliard is driving home after meeting with a friend. She takes a shortcut and turns into an icy, slippery road. In the dark, she loses control of the rear-wheel drive car. The vehicle crashes into a ditch. Emergency lights, snowfall, night, and a hard frost. Jean gets out of the vehicle. She's wearing only a light winter coat, mittens, and cowboy boots. The air temperature is much lower than in a freezer. Jean is sure that her friend lives nearby, so she goes that way. She climbs a high hill and realizes she's taken the wrong route. It seems she's gotten lost. The girl wanders a couple more miles and notices her other friend's house in the distance. Freezing, she walks there. Then everything turns black. Jean loses consciousness. The next morning, rancher Wally Nelson wakes up in a great mood. It's the holiday season. There's a winter fairy tale outside the window. He leaves his house and notices the body of Jean Hilliard lying just a few feet from his porch. Wally approaches the girl, shakes her, and is horrified. Her body is stiff and cold like frozen wood. Her eyes are open and don't move. Her hair is frozen. She just doesn't look alive. But Wally sees that she's still breathing. Jean has managed to survive. Wally wants to put her in his car to bring her to the doctor, but the girl's body doesn't bend and can't fit into the auto. It feels like a statue. He takes a bigger car and rushes to the hospital as fast as possible. The doctors take Jean, but they don't think she has any chance to make it. Her hand is so hard and frozen that no needle can penetrate it. A low temperature, glassy eyes, and muscles as hard as stone are all the results of emergency mode. Her body has directed all the blood to the vital organs to ensure their functioning. That's why other parts of her body look so lifeless, and her skin and muscles don't react to anything. The doctors decide to put heating pads on the girl to warm her up. Her family hopes for her recovery, but right now, all they can do is just wait. Frostbite is so dangerous because all that frozen liquid begins to expand. Fill a small bottle with water and put it in the freezer for a few hours. Then take it out, and you'll see that the bottle seems to have expanded or even cracked because of the increased volume of the liquid. The same thing happens inside our bodies. We consist of almost 70% water. When it freezes, its particles turn into ice crystals and tear cell membranes. Ice fragments can stretch and destroy tissue. This is called frostbite. Also, our body can slow down all internal processes in extreme cold conditions to save strength and energy. The heart makes fewer beats, and the lungs stop consuming lots of oxygen. Metabolism slows down. It happened with Jean, and perhaps it is what saved her life that day. She was lying in the snow in severe frost for about 6 hours. But why didn't the ice particles start destroying her cell membranes? How did her body withstand such damage and manage to survive? Back at the hospital, doctors are happy to watch Jean get better. Warm blood spreads through the frozen vessels and brings her body back to life. Surprisingly, ice crystals haven't damaged her muscles and skin. A few hours later, the girl regains consciousness. By noon, she starts talking. Jean doesn't know what happened. She remembers walking to her friend's house and then waking up in the hospital. What worries her most right now is that her father's car is somewhere in a ditch. As it turns out, the girl fell down and crawled on all fours to Wally Nelson's house. She doesn't remember it, but apparently her brain activated the survival instinct that night. Unfortunately, she didn't manage to crawl the last few feet. Jean passed out at the door and stayed there for 6 hours. Doctors examine the girl and understand that she's completely healthy. Soon, she's discharged from the hospital. This case isn't unique. One professor of emergency medicine, David Plummer, said he'd seen about 12 similar cases over the past 10 years when patients had survived severe frostbite. Jean returns home and finds out that she has become famous. People write about her in newspapers, want to interview her, and film documentary shows. Her case has attracted the attention of many doctors around the world, but no one has been able to find out exactly how she managed to survive. In the case of humans, such recoveries seem like an absolute miracle. But many creatures of the natural world can adapt their bodies to extreme conditions. One of them is the tree frog. These animals live mainly in temperate and tropical parts of Eurasia. Sometimes they have to contend with cold weather. Their body injects glucose into the bloodstream when they feel they're freezing, and the content of their cells turns into syrup. Sugar lowers the freezing point of water. So, tree frogs have adapted to such conditions. The water outside their cells can freeze. Their bodies can get as hard as ice cubes, but they will be alive, feeling great. Then, when it gets warmer, they fully recover. The blood fills their body and puts all their muscles in motion. But one of the most amazing animals that can withstand freezing temperatures is the ghoulish icefish. It's transparent and somewhat like a jellyfish. It swims in the dark, cold Antarctic waters. The ghoulish icefish feels comfortable there because of the antifreeze in its body. More precisely, it's a unique substance that is like antifreeze in its functions. This liquid doesn't allow the animal's cells, organs, and the whole body to freeze. There are no red blood cells in the fish's blood that transport oxygen throughout its body. This is the only vertebrate with such a superpower. There are organisms on our planet that use the cold to prolong their life. Scientists have found some of them in the ice of Siberia. Those are microscopic, multi-celled creatures, like small worms, that can live in a freezer for about 10 years. But the worms from Siberia were about 24,000 years old. The scientists transported them to the laboratory and thawed them. The worms came to life and began to multiply immediately after all those centuries of sleep. Their bodies can go into cryptobiosis. This is when an entire frozen organism has minimal vital functions. The analysis showed that the worms could stay in this mode for tens of thousands of years. And there are many such animals on our planet. Also, these creatures are some of the world's most resistant to radiation. They are practically invulnerable. Now back to our story. It's possible that Jean Hilliard's body went into short cryptobiosis. Perhaps there was some non-freezing liquid in the girl's blood, but no one knows for sure. These days, she has an ordinary job and almost doesn't remember that day. Further research on this topic can help scientists create special medicines that can help in freezing temperatures. Just imagine that you could safely go outside in the winter wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Steam would be coming off your body, and the ice under your feet would be melting. You'd feel hot inside. A dream, perhaps. But realistically, winter coat manufacturers would, of course, never allow it.